Hey everybody, it's Lindsay. Today we are talking about abortion. I know that probably gave you a little bit of a sort of thing. And so to introduce the topic, what I always like to tell people is that as an educator, my job is to tell you sort of the facts about abortion. Who gets abortion? Why do people get abortion? How does it look? These sort of things. My intention is never to ask you to change your values, because your values and your beliefs around sort of the morality and the ideas about abortion are up to you. That is not my job as an educator to tell you how to feel about it. I'm just here to tell you sort of the facts about it. So there is a factual side and then sort of the moralistic side of the discussion. Obviously, some people will debate whether something is a fact or a moral issue. For the most of this lecture, I try to stick to just sort of scientific medical knowledge around abortion, and then leave you to figure out your sort of beliefs and feelings about abortion with whoever it is that you decide those sort of things, whether it be with your family values, whether it be with sort of your religious beliefs, whether it be a whole bunch of different sort of things. Those are yours to explore, and those are something that are outside of my purview as an educator. Okay, so one of the things that I always like to start with is when I talk about abortion is, if we want to talk about abortion, the thing we first need to talk about is unintended pregnancy, because unintended pregnancy is the number one cause of abortion. If we don't want abortions to happen, then we want to make sure that people are not accidentally getting pregnant or getting pregnant because they don't want to. So when we think about who is getting accidentally pregnant, about half of the US population, about 50% of pregnancies in the United States are unplanned. That means people weren't looking to have a baby, weren't trying to have a baby, maybe were actively trying not to have a baby, and for some reason they got pregnant. And we can talk about sort of why those things happen. If half of all pregnancies are unintended, well, we know that about 18% of abortions will end, of unintended pregnancies end in abortion. So if we want to reduce the number of abortions, which I think most people would agree is a good thing, is reducing the number of abortions, we need to focus on the unintended pregnancies, not just on legalistic rules about who can or can't and all these sort of things. What we want to say is, hey, let's get better at not getting pregnant when we don't want to, and that will actually reduce abortions a substantial amount. Abortion is much more common than people realize. People think it's this weird sort of thing that happens very rarely, but in fact, that's actually pretty much wrong. About 1/3 of American women have had an abortion in their lifetime by age 45. The reasons why, how, who, when, all those sort of things are quite varied, but 1/3, so about 33% of American women have had an abortion, and that's just not common knowledge, because abortion is something that is very political. It is something that is very private, and a lot of people don't like to talk about their experience with abortion. And so I think that's a really important sort of thing, to just normalize it and say, yeah, this is a thing that a lot of people do. If you don't know somebody who has had abortion, you probably do, they just probably haven't told you about it, okay? In addition to people who have abortions, there's lots of other people who are affected by it, right? The families of people who have abortions, whether it be their partners, whether it be parents, whether it be siblings, whether it be friends and partners. There are a lot of people who are affected by this issue, even if they aren't the one who is directly impacted by the abortion themselves. History has shown us that abortion has been around forever and ever, that if we make abortion illegal, it doesn't make abortion go away. It just makes abortions more unsafe, and leads to more death of not only the fetus, but also of the people who are carrying the babies as well. And so when we think about abortion, I think it is okay to say, yeah, we want to reduce the number of abortions that happen, but how do we do that? Well, we do that by focusing on unplanned pregnancy, not on making abortion illegal. When we talk about this, a lot of people want to say, you know, there's the pro-abortion side and the anti-abortion side. For the most part, nobody's pro-abortion. Nobody thinks like, yeah, abortion sounds like a fun thing to do. Let's go on Tuesday and get an abortion. For most people, they say like, oh, this was a really hard, terrible sort of decision that I felt that I needed to make. And so it's important that when we talk about these sort of things, pro-choice really just means that you have the choice about what you want to do with that pregnancy, whether that means carrying that pregnancy to full term, whether it means carrying that pregnancy to full term and then giving a baby up for adoption, or whether that means, hey, I'm a person who doesn't want to be pregnant. That also is your right, and that is your choice. But I think it's really important that we get away from this sort of pro-abortion talk, because almost nobody is pro-abortion. I won't say nobody, because there's always people who are something. And so people who are pro-choice will say, you know what, this is not something that I get to decide for another person. This is something that a pregnant person and their provider should be able to talk about and figure out what works best for them. And so that's what it is. You can be absolutely pro-life for yourself to say, I myself might not ever have an abortion, but for a lot of pro-choice people, they say it's just not my business to tell somebody else what to do with their body. So some key points to remember about abortion. Abortion is safe. It's really safe, and we'll talk more about safety in this lecture. It is currently legal and has been legal since 1973, and it's much more common, as I said, than people realize. About, again, 1/3 of American women have had an abortion. The best way to reduce abortion, as I've said, is to reduce unintended pregnancies. If you don't unintendedly or have an unplanned pregnancy, then abortion isn't even a topic. As somebody who doesn't have regular sex unprotected with men, I don't have to worry about it. I've never had an abortion, but that's because I've never needed one. And so when we think about these sort of things, how do we promote things that will prevent an unintended pregnancy from happening? Abortion is highest amongst white women. Not a surprise, since white women are the largest majority of women in this country. So the people who get pregnant tend to be more often than not white women. So about 36% of abortions happen with white women. But we know that also abortion disproportionately affects women of color, poor women, and other sort of things as a percentage of the population. We'll talk about why that is in a little bit. We know that most people who get abortions are in their 20s. And so it's in that sort of, I am an adult, but I'm not quite ready to be a parent sort of stage. A lot of people assume that people who get an abortion have no sort of faith background. They aren't religious people. They aren't somebody who deals with the moralistic sort of side, and that's actually really factually wrong. About 73% of people who have abortions are somebody who feels that they have a religious affiliation or some sort of faith guidance. And so it's not merely an idea of like, oh, these godless heathens are the people who are getting abortions, and then there's the sort of people who believe in a God. No, a lot of people who believe in God or some sort of higher power still choose an abortion because it feels what is right for them. Another surprising fact that a lot of people don't know is that about 61% of people who have an abortion already have a child. Let that sink in for a minute. For what happens in sort of media and narrative about sort of people who are getting abortions is because, oh, they're selfish and they don't want to give up certain things in their life, blah, 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 all these sort of things. Well, actually the reality is most people who have abortions know what it's like to be a parent because they are a parent. They've had a baby before. They know the trials and tribulations of being pregnant, going through delivery, raising a child, and for whatever reason, they're deciding, yeah, now is not the time to do that for me. And so there are a lot more people who have abortions who have already had a child than people who don't. And so that is a common sort of myth I like to dispel in terms of the bigger picture of these sort of things. We're currently in an era where we are working to tighten sort of regulations and make it harder to get an abortion. There's going to be 2 links from the Guttmacher Institute for you to look at. The Guttmacher Institute tracks sexual and reproductive health across the country, and they do a lot of work on abortion related sort of stuff. So they'll tell you about current laws, current sort of things that are going on, current number of providers in the country for these sort of things. All of those sort of things are in an effort to reduce the availability of abortion, not necessarily the acceptability or the thoughts or the ideas. It's just to say you can't do these sort of things. So reducing access to abortion, especially when it's done through lies and manipulation, feels really gross to me. Again, if you're totally anti-abortion and you want to make that case, then make the case and make it based on factual sort of things. Talk about your belief system, your morality, that sort of stuff. But lying and manipulating people and just flat out making it too hard feels like a really terrible sort of thing to do. And if your cause and your sort of argument was just, you wouldn't need to rely on those sort of things. And so I think that's just an important sort of thing to think about for right now. So let's talk a little bit about the history of abortion. Abortion was widely accepted and used up through the 1700s. Why? Well, we didn't have contraceptives then, and sometimes people were like, yeah, I don't want to have a baby because of reasons, and so they would have an abortion. There was no real discussion of it being bad or immoral or any of these sort of current contemporary discussions about sort of the validity and the morality of abortion. It was just, hey, is this something that's going to work for our family or not? If not, the only way to get rid of a pregnancy was to have an abortion because they didn't have condoms or contraceptives. It was permitted until quickening, which was the old school way of when you could feel fetal movement. So this typically happens in that 12 to 16 week period. The reason that it was was illegal after that was not because of morality sort of issues, but because of the increased likelihood of death of the person who was pregnant. In the 1800s, we did see a time where abortion was illegal. And again, this was not because of sort of moralistic or religious sort of reasons directly. Much of the abortion laws that happened in the 1800s were because of the rise of the medical profession. So doctors, the American Medical Association, other people who were medical sort of professionals wanted to control sort of what they called quackery. So people who would give at-home sort of abortions, or, you know, sort of herbal remedies or other sort of things that would induce an abortion. And so they wanted to make sure that it was something that was done in a more medical sort of standard. Again, one of the reasons that people wanted to outlaw abortion was a religious reason, but not about the morality of sort of killing a fetus or not. It was more about the control of women, right? Abortion has always been about the control of women. One of the reasons that people wanted to have a legal abortion was it was a way to cover up the sins of fornication. So the thought was, well, if men are off fighting wars or doing other sort of things, off great expansion into the West, then women could just be slutty hoes and have sex with whoever they wanted. And if they got pregnant, then we wouldn't know that they were slutty hoes if they could get an abortion. And so if we got rid of abortion, then we would know who those women were who were cheating on their husbands or having sex before marriage because they would be pregnant and they couldn't get rid of the baby. Yes, again, no sort of discussion around the value of life for all these other sort of things. It really was about controlling women. There was also some concern about the declining birth rate. In the beginning sort of the United States colonies, women were having about an average of 7 children each. By the 1800s, that was reduced by half, and families were only having, you know, like 3 or 4 kids. And as part of this same sort of thing that was going on, the great, you know, sort of expansion of the United States, people were like, no, we need to have lots of kids because we need to have a big American country with lots and lots of people. And if women are not having babies enough, then we're not going to be a big, strong country. Again, nothing about sort of the morality of abortion, just more about like using women as tools to try and achieve greatness or other sort of things. So in colonial America, abortion was a very common sort of thing. Abstinence didn't work for people who had no choice in whether or not they wanted to have sex. There were no contraceptives or other sort of things. And so abortion was the way that you prevented yourself from having a baby if that was not something that you wanted to do. Again, it was not this sort of discussion around morality and stuff that we see now. So abortion stayed illegal up until 1973, when a very famous court case, Roe v. Wade, went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decided in that sort of moment to legalize abortion. They split up their ruling into 3 different parts, and they ruled it by trimester because they're cheeky like that. And so the first trimester is that first 12 weeks of pregnancy. States cannot interfere with a decision to terminate a pregnancy, except for they can require it to be performed by a doctor. So there's supposed to be no legal limitations on abortion in the first trimester, except if you are a state that wants to make it done by a doctor, you can have it done in that sort of way. Second trimester abortions is in that 4 to 6 months sort of period. So 13 weeks up to 20-ish, 24 weeks. There's some debate there, which we'll talk about. States can regulate the conditions for an abortion, but they can't limit the reasons for abortion, is what the Supreme Court said. So they said anybody can get one, but you can totally, for states, make sort of laws about where it can be done. It doesn't have to be done in a hospital. Can it be done in a clinic? Who can do it? What are the other sort of things that need to be done? And so we see a lot of current litigation in the United States in this sort of area. So places saying like, oh, well, you have to have admitting privileges, or you have to have a certain size of sidewalks or a certain size of parking lot to be able to have an abortion. And they use them as standards of care, even though like what a parking lot doesn't really have anything to do with the standards of care. And this is where a lot of the current sort of court cases are focused. States will say, we want to make it hard to get an abortion. And so we come up with all these rules that we say are standards of care. People who are abortion rights activists say those are not standards of care. And so we're going to sue you. And so this is where all the current sort of debate is. Third trimester, so this last part, 24 weeks up to 40 weeks of pregnancy, states can either forbid an abortion or they can regulate it, except to save the life of a mother. And so that was the Supreme Court ruling for Roe v. Wade, was saying third trimester, The only reason that you can't outlaw it is if it's going to kill the person who is pregnant, but you can regulate it, you can forbid it, all these other sort of things. Nobody in this entire country, in the 50 states, allows third trimester abortion just for shits and giggles. Let me repeat that, okay? Nobody, this sort of late term abortion that is being pushed again by sort of conservative anti-abortion people is not a thing. Nobody has an abortion electively in the third trimester just because they just, never mind, I've decided and I've changed my mind. The only time that people have abortions in the third trimester is when there is a fundamental incompatibility with life. So if the baby is going to be born with severe abnormalities and isn't going to survive, if the baby is going to die in utero, if the mother might die while giving birth, those are the sort of reasons that people have an abortion this late in the game. If somebody has been pregnant for 7 months, they want that baby, right? And the only reason that they wouldn't have the baby is because there's something fundamentally wrong. And so it's really, really important for people to understand that when people talk about sort of third trimester abortions and late abortions, they're not actually talking about regular sort of choice-based sort of abortions. What they're talking about is already a heartbreaking situation, and people are only making it worse and more uncomfortable for people who know this baby isn't going to survive, and now I have to go through all this legal sort of paperwork to even try and reduce the suffering that me and this baby might be able to feel. Very importantly, the Supreme Court declined to address where human life begins, right? And that is where a lot of the argument of the current contemporary abortion debate centers around. When does life begin? For this one, I can't tell you because, again, there is no medical sort of definitive answer about when life begins. It is much more of a moralistic sort of value about your belief system. And so I can tell you when lots of different people think that life begins. Some people believe that life begins at the moment of egg and sperm fertilizing, right? So that moment those things join way up in the fallopian tube, some people say that is when life begins, okay? Some people say, well, yeah, but a lot of times sperm and eggs will join together and then they pass through naturally and then a pregnancy doesn't uptake. And so, no, that's not when life begins. Life begins at the moment of fertilization. So when that fertilized egg implants into the uterine lining and starts to grow into a fetus. Some people say that's when life begins, when we actually see a pregnancy. So usually in that sort of 2-week period after getting pregnant where your hormones start to read, yes, I am a pregnant sort of person. Some people believe that life begins when you can hear a heartbeat. So generally speaking, we can hear a heartbeat around 6 to 8 weeks. A lot of that depends on sort of the technology used and these sort of things, but some people say once a heart is beating, that is when life begins. And so some people will use that sort of 6 to 8 week period. Some people say life begins whenever viability happens. Viability is the ability of a baby to live outside of the person who is pregnant. So for the most part, we say 24 weeks is our earliest state of viability. If you're born before 24 weeks, you're unlikely to survive. Even if you're born at 24 weeks, the chances of survival are pretty slim, less than 50%. But we do have records of babies who were born at 24 weeks surviving. And so for most people, they say, yes, at the point at which a baby can survive outside of the person who is pregnant, so the mother or whoever, that is when life begins. And so this is where sort of all the different points are. And so this is where people argue about different sort of things. Some people just say, no, it's not a human, and it's not a life, and you're not ending a life until it's actually born and can't survive. Some people say, no, it's a life from the moment that it has begun in terms of conception. Whether you believe in one point or another, I can't tell you. Again, that is something that you have to sort of sort out and figure out based on your values and your belief systems, as well as science. And so I'll just leave it there for that sort of point. Now, if we look at sort of abortion over time, well, in 1973, when Roe v. Wade happened, we saw a huge spike in abortions because it was the first time it was available and people were like, holy moly. We also didn't have really great contraceptives back then. But since the 1980s till today, abortion has been decreasing every single year, mostly because we have gotten really good at contraceptives and we've gotten really good at educating people, right? We know that if people are educated and have access to contraceptives, the likelihood of them becoming pregnant when they don't want to is very, very slim. And so that's an important sort of thing to note. We have been reducing abortions over the past 3 decades, and we will continue to do those things, and not because of outlawing or restricting access, but because of better education and better contraceptive technology. In California, where we are, what is the abortion law? California has some of the most liberal abortion laws, which is why we have so many more abortions than anywhere else in the country. In California, you don't have to be a physician to provide an abortion. You can also be a nurse practitioner, you can be a physician's assistant, or you can be a certified nurse midwife. In a lot of states, you can only have a doctor do it, and that limits the amount of people who could do it. In California, we have many more medical professionals who are qualified to do an abortion, and so because of that, there are much more abortions that happen in California. In the second trimester, up to 24 weeks, it is legal to have an abortion, but it has to be done by a physician after 12 weeks. So between 12 and 24 weeks, it is a little bit more of a complicated procedure, and so they want it to be done by a physician. But that's the only standard of care that you have to meet in California. It is illegal after viability, so after that 24 weeks, unless the health of the mother is at stake. And so in California, you can get an abortion up to 24 weeks. After that, the only way it would happen is if the life of the mother is at risk. Technically, in California, parental consent is required. However, a court case in the 90s fought that and said, no, actually, if you are over the age of consent for sex, which is 13 in California in terms of making sexual health decisions, then you can seek those sort of things without parental consent. However, it hasn't been removed from the books because people really wanted to keep it on there. It's just not enforceable. And so it's this weird sort of gray area. In California, counseling is required for abortion, just like everywhere. You do pre-abortion counseling where they tell you what it's about, here's the things, give you all the information that you need, but there's no specific guidelines in California about what you have to be told or how it is delivered to you, okay? So thinking again about contraceptive use, because again, my whole point around abortion is if we get better at contraceptive use, we will have an automatic reduction in abortions. Virtually all American women have used contraception at some point in their life. About 98% of women have used contraceptives at least once in their lifetime, if not more regularly, right? That's a big number, almost 100%, right? And so we know that people use contraceptives. Now, 89% of the people who have an unintended pregnancy are currently using a contraceptive. What? Yeah, well, what we know is that contraceptives are not 100% effective, right? We know that abstinence used perfectly and correctly every time is the only way to avoid pregnancy. So anytime people are having sex, even if they're using contraceptives, there is a risk of becoming pregnant. And we also know that people are kind of crappy at using birth control, right? Some people will forget to take a pill. Sometimes you just have that one time where you forgot a condom. All these other sort of reasons. And so people who get unintentionally pregnant often say like, oh, but I was trying really hard not to get pregnant, and yet something still happened, right? And so it's not a irresponsibility sort of thing. It's not oh, you just didn't care and you were selfish and you were thinking about these sort of things. People were actively trying not to get pregnant, and yet they still did get pregnant. Of the people who get unintentionally pregnant, but at the time weren't using birth control, most of them have used birth control in the past. And so again, it's not an issue of, I didn't know, I'm ignorant and these sort of things. I just didn't have birth control at the time. Most of the people who haven't used birth control are people who are poor, women of color, people who have less access to getting contraceptives. And so one of the things that we've done in this country is try to expand that under the Affordable Care Act. That's one of the big things was trying to expand access to contraceptive care. Now, when we think about sort of abortion, the risk of abortion is very minimal, especially when it's done by a qualified medical professional in a clinical sort of setting. Fewer than 1% of all abortions have any kind of major complications. In fact, the risk of death associated with abortion is 0.6 per 100,000 procedures, and that's less than 1/10 as large as the risk associated with childbirth. So if we really wanted to protect women or pregnant people and say, hey, we really want to protect you and we don't want you to die, then we would outlaw childbirth, because actually childbirth is 10 times riskier than getting an abortion, right? Oftentimes sort of the argument is that, oh, abortion is so risky, it's going to hurt women, it's going to kill people, but actually that's not true. Childbirth is far more risky than abortion is, right? The choice of which procedure to get is largely dependent on the personal sort of preference of the person getting an abortion and the length of the pregnancy, of how far along they are when they decide to seek out an abortion. In all cases, everybody will determine that there's a lack of coercion that is happening. At some point when somebody is getting an abortion, they will be pulled separately from whoever their support person is, whether it be a parent or a partner, to say, is this something you personally actually want? Because they want to make sure that they're not performing abortions on anybody who doesn't want one. Even if they're getting pressure from a partner or a parent or other sort of things, people who are providing abortions want to make sure that the person who is getting it actually wants it, right? And so it's really important that coercion is left out of the equation. Now, when it comes to abortion costs, this is not a cheap thing. On the low end, sort of the abortion pill or surgical abortion in the first trimester is generally around this $500 mark, right? And so this idea that like, oh, people just get abortions instead of using birth control doesn't make even financial sense. Most states don't cover abortion, and most people are not spending $500 to get an abortion all the time when they could spend far less money by using contraceptives. The farther a pregnancy goes on, the cost goes up because it is a much more complicated sort of procedure. This week there are videos about surgical abortions as well as the pill abortion. I talk a little bit about why people choose one or the other, and a lot of it has to do with sort of preferences and length of pregnancy. For the most part, what we need to talk about is if we want to reduce abortion, we need to increase contraceptive use and make sure that people are educated about these sort of things. We should promote abstinence and contraceptive use, not just one. We know that students who go to abstinence-only schools actually don't have lower rates of pregnancy than those who go to inclusive education schools, and so that's a really important sort of thing. We need to improve access to abortions or to contraceptive services, including emergency contraceptive, because again, if we prevent somebody becoming pregnant, that's going to prevent abortion in the wide sense of things. We know that we've done some really good sort of work federally on different levels of insurance coverage. Family planning services, Title X funding are all things that have increased access for low-income people who need access to reproductive care. Planned Parenthood is always a big sort of issue. Abortion is only about 3% of the services that Planned Parenthood does. 97% of the services that Planned Parenthood does are not abortion care related services. They are contraceptive services, they're pap smears, they're mammograms, all these other sort of things. And Planned Parenthood is our #1 provider of healthcare across this country for most women. About 20% of women in this country live in a county where Planned Parenthood is the only option for getting any kind of reproductive health care services. And so the idea that we should defund Planned Parenthood because they're abortion providers is just silly. They do provide abortions, yes, but they provide so much more, and for a lot of people that's the only place that they can get regular checkups to check for cervical cancer and other sort of things. So my closing thought is always one of this: abortion's not just this standalone sort of thing. It's not just this thing that somebody randomly thinks one day like, oh, I should go and do this. No, it's actually the last stage of a pregnancy where people have tried probably really hard to not be pregnant. They probably wanted to get education. They probably tried to use contraceptives. They probably tried to do lots of different sort of things, and now they're faced with, hey, here's this ultimate sort of choice. I'm pregnant and I don't want to be. How do I deal with this, right? And so abortion really is this sort of end stage thing that can be prevented at many other points in time. We just have to do better as a society to be able to do those sort of things, okay? That is all for this week. I know this was a long video. Hopefully it was informative. There's some other videos that are on Blackboard. Hopefully you will watch those and be able to consider these things with an open mind. All right, thanks, bye.